Our opening thought comes from Reinhold Niebuhr, from the essential Reinhold Niebuhr Selected Essays and Addresses. Niebuhr writes, "Our capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but our inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary." Our next reading comes from Carl Sagan in his work, The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. Sagan writes, "If we can't think for ourselves, if we're unwilling to question authority, then we're just putty in the hands of those in power. But if the citizens are educated and form their own opinions, then those in power work for us. In every country, we should be teaching our children the scientific method and the reasons for a Bill of Rights. With it comes a certain decency, humility, and community spirit. In the demon-haunted world that we inhabit, by virtue of being human, this may be all that stands between us and the enveloping darkness." Our next reading comes from Wendell Berry, from The Art of the Commonplace, the Agrarian Essays Justice Collective. Wendell Berry writes, "The great enemy of freedom is the alignment of political power with wealth. This alignment destroys the commonwealth, that is, the natural wealth of localities and the local economies of household, neighborhood, and community, and so destroys democracy, of which the Commonwealth is the foundation and practical means." For our discourse this morning, I'm continuing our reflections on the 8 principles. Today we're looking at the 5th principle, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. I'll begin with another reading. This reading is from Reverend Parissa Parsa, who's reflecting on the 5th principle. "In our religious lives, the democratic process requires trust in the development of each individual conscience, a belief that such development is possible for each of us, as well as a commitment to cultivate our own conscience. We could call it a commitment to the value of each person. In the words of Theodore Parker, democracy means not, quote, 'I am as good as you are,' end quote, but, quote, 'you are as good as I am,' end quote. My connection with the sacred is only as precious as my willingness to acknowledge the same connection in others." This comes from the 7 Principles in Word and Worship, edited by Ellen Brandenburg. So the evidence is overwhelming that communities with vibrant, participatory, democratic processes in which the value and the conscience of all persons are respected, the evidence is overwhelming that those democratic communities are the most just, the most peaceful, the most flourishing, and the most sustainable communities in the world. How can then UUs model the importance of the right of conscience and participatory democracy in our society when so many persons seem drawn to autocratic leaders and practices? When we look to see, both historically and in our contemporary world, where and who the haters of democracy are, we find that they are typically persons of wealth and persons of power who want to control the political landscape to maintain and expand their wealth and their power. As most of you know, I teach philosophy at Oklahoma City University, and in my teaching of philosophy and in my reading of philosophy, I get to read a lot of Plato and Aristotle. And while there is much in Plato and in Aristotle that I appreciate, the more I read Plato and Aristotle, the more I am struck by how their positions of power and privilege influence their philosophies, especially when it comes to their political views and their criticisms of democracy. If you've read Plato or Aristotle, you know that they are not fans of democracy. Plato believed that a monarchy was the best form of government, and conveniently for him as a philosopher, he believed that only philosophers should be kings, because only philosophers had access to true wisdom and to knowledge of the eternal forms of goodness and justice that one needs to rule in a society. Aristotle, in a similar way, a little bit different, but Aristotle argued that only persons who have leisure time to cultivate both moral virtues and intellectual virtues should participate directly in the political process, thus precluding the political participation of the vast majority of persons in the society of his time. Their positions of power, their positions of privilege, leads them to a kind of elitism that tends to lead them to reject democracy as being a good form of government. Unfortunately, Plato's and Aristotle's anti-democratic perspectives get carried over into Christian political thought, owing to Plato's and Aristotle's influence on two of the most influential Christian theologians in the history of Christian thought, Augustine and Aquinas, respectively. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430 CE, not too long after Christianity became an acceptable religion in the Roman Empire under Constantine, and during Augustine's life, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under the Emperor Theodosius. And then Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274, Augustine and Aquinas were two of the most influential apologists for the church's acceptance of the autocracy of empire. They were the two most influential apologists for the church's acceptance of the autocracy of empire. And they used the philosophical framework of Plato through Plotinus, someone who followed Plato's perspectives in the case of Augustine. So Augustine learned about Plato not directly from Plato, but through the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus. And then in the case of Aquinas, he was, for the most part, influenced by Aristotle. And so both Plato and Aristotle influenced Augustine and Aquinas in their case for the acceptance of autocracy over democracy. And eventually, this gets expressed in things like the divine right of kings and the emphasis on the importance of following the will and the dictates of the king in order to be a faithful Christian in the world. Now, even though Christianity was compromised by autocracy before Augustine was born and long before Aquinas was born, even though Christianity accepted autocratic forms of leadership before Augustine and Aquinas were around. The anti-democratic influence of Plato and Aristotle on Augustine and Aquinas still plays a role in developing and perpetuating Christian political thought that is supportive of autocracy. Now, don't want to pick on Christianity alone. There are forms of autocratic thinking in other world religions, and religious nationalism based in other world religions also ends up leading to supporting autocratic political structures as well. But in our society, the fact that Christian political thought is supportive of autocracy and autocratic movements is more germane to our particular situation. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that many of the autocratic movements in the West have been cloaked in Christian language. They've been cloaked in Christian thought that is supportive of autocracy. If you look today at the primary drivers of failed democracies in our world, I would put them into three categories. The three primary drivers of failed democracies are: one, echoing Wendell Berry here, the infusion of money into the political process, which gives the wealthy disproportionate power and influence. First driver. Second driver, the belief that some persons or groups of persons are of less value than some other persons or groups of persons. And then three, the third driver, is the diminished economic and educational opportunities for significant portions of the population, which have come about owing to one and two, the infusion of money into politics and the belief that some persons are of less value than other persons. More simply put, autocrats make use of their wealth and power to gain, maintain, and expand their power while using things like religion and race. Using religion and race to divide people, to pit people against one another as a way of distracting them from the real reasons why they are experiencing diminishing economic opportunities and diminishing political influence. By getting us to point the finger of blame in relation to our problems at one another, the autocrats are successful in fully consolidating their own wealth and power within society. This is not true freedom. This is not a kind of freedom that will endure. And though it may be disguised sometimes as democracy, oftentimes what we think is a vibrant, full democracy is not really a full and vibrant democracy. It's something closer to oligarchy. So even though it's often disguised as democracy, this is actually what oligarchy looks like: the control of the wealthy, the control of the powerful of our political processes. If you look at history, if you look throughout history and even up to this very day, there are those who are arguing against democracy, usually because they're wanting to protect their power and wealth, but they put forward other arguments against democracy besides that. They say things like, democracy is not the best form of government for us because many persons are not educated enough to participate responsibly in the democratic processes. You've probably heard people say that before. I don't want, quote, those people voting. They're not, quote, educated enough to make responsible political choices. They're not educated enough to vote. That excuse that was used for years to keep the most vulnerable persons within our communities from voting. This issue of education, though, is not a problem with democracy. It's a problem of cultivating the societal will to create systems by which all persons have equitable access to the education that would help us make responsible political choices. Today, many who make this lack of education of the masses argument against democracy are the very same persons who are creating barriers for the equitable access to high-quality public education. A society that gives up on public education, a society that gives up on a high-quality public education, is a society that is giving up on democracy. Often those who call out the loudest for freedom, you've heard a lot of people call out loud for freedom and more freedom in our society. Often those who call out the loudest for freedom are the least willing to protect the conditions that will allow true and enduring freedom to exist in a society. You cannot have real freedom without freedom of conscience, without protecting the right of conscience. And you cannot have freedom of conscience without freedom of religion, or, in some cases, freedom from religion. And you cannot have freedom of religion or freedom of religious expression without separation of church and state, which includes not doing anything to establish one religion as the religion of the state. Thus, those who call for freedom, while also calling for us to be a Christian nation, are actually undermining the most important conditions for freedom in our society. Christian nationalism and true and enduring freedom are contradictory propositions. A vibrant and enduring democracy is not possible in a society that does not protect the freedom of conscience to orient oneself to religion as one sees fit, as long as such religious orientation is not expressed in ways that harm others. The case for the right of conscience, the case for the freedom of conscience expressed through democracy is a strong one. Throughout the world, the evidence shows us that there is a clear correlation between vibrant democracy and human flourishing and also ecological flourishing. Vibrant, full democracies are demonstrably happier, healthier, better educated, less corrupt, more equitable, more participatory, more just, and yes, even more peaceful than flawed democracies, and also societies with autocratic forms of government. While it is true that not everyone gets exactly what they want within a democracy, that's true. That's kind of life, isn't it? It is much more likely that we will get what we need to flourish as persons within a community where each person's freedom of conscience is respected and persons are empowered to express themselves as persons of equal value within the democratic process. In other words, in a democracy, you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, you'll find you get what you need, or something like that. Famous 20th century philosopher, I think, said that, right? Respecting the freedom of others and treating each other as persons with equal and inherent worth That is what true and enduring freedom looks like. When Unitarian Universalists affirm the right of conscience and the use of the right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, we are affirming a right and a process that helps us all make progress together towards a more beloved community. May we make it so. Our closing thought comes from Willy Brandt, speech from 1987. Brandt says, "If I am to say what, besides peace, is more important to me than anything else, my unconditional answer is freedom. Freedom for the many, not merely for a few. Freedom of conscience and of opinion, and also freedom from poverty and fear."